Hey Patreon viewers, Matt Easton here. Of course, Scholar Gladiatore, you know that because you're here. But I thought I'd do a relatively brief video. I'm going to feature a sword on the main channel, but I thought I'd just talk to you guys a bit about it first. And fundamentally, it's a model of sword that I have had before. Some examples are nicer than others, but I haven't had a really nice one for a while, and it is this. So it is the French model 1822 light cavalry sabre. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. It's sometimes known, or in fact known in the French army and in a lot of modern reference books, as the bancal, B-A-N-C-A-L. I actually am not sure how that name, the bancal, came about. I'm sure I've read it at some point in the past, but I can't remember the details. But fundamentally, this was a very iconic French cavalry sword that was used obviously from 1822, because it's the model 1822. It probably actually came into service a year or two after that. We often find that's the case. So often if there's a model of sword, which that's the year that it was kind of patented, or that design was put into the records books, often you find that regiments don't actually receive that new model of sword until about a year or two later. And that's true of most armies. So for example, the 1796 light cavalry sabre in the British Army probably wasn't really common in the light cavalry until about 1798 in reality. They're probably still using the 1888 pattern predominantly until that point. And in fact, if we look at Jean-Gaspard Le Marchant's cavalry sword manual, the cavalry sword exercise of 1796, despite the fact that he himself designed the 1796 light cavalry sabre, it's not really what's shown in his manuals. It's a sword that's kind of like a 1788, it seems to be like. But anyway, back to this sword, the bancal, or the 1822 French light cavalry sword. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about it on this video, because I'm going to talk more about it in my main video on the main channel. But really just to say, I was reminded when I got this one of what a nice sword they are. Now they do have some issues from the point of view of a swordsman. You'll notice that they are curved. Despite this, it was fairly widespread within the French cavalry during the 19th century, and in fact going all the way back to the Napoleonic period, that French cavalry were taught to predominantly thrust if they could. Now that's not to say that they thrust all the time. In fact, probably the fact that this appears in the records is indicative of the fact that very often they didn't, they were cutting. But there is this repeated kind of note in regards to French cavalry that they were ordered to give point. Now, this is not really a sword which is well adapted to giving point for a number of reasons. Number one, it's curved, okay? Now, yes, you can thrust with curved swords. In fact, if you imagine you're on horseback and you're thrusting at infantry, the infantry, their chest height is going to dictate that you're going to be holding the sword down here by the side of your leg or hip, and actually that lines up the point quite nicely to be thrusting infantry through the chest, for example. But against other cavalry, what it means is you can't really give a point straight on that way. You actually, to give point, usually would lift the hilt up that way and thrust like this. Now you can of course deliver the point, and remember that when you're delivering point or delivering a thrust on horseback, you've got to get it out again. And as I've talked about in previous videos, and we can see from the World War I era Pathé videos, which you can find on YouTube actually, showing British cavalry recruits being trained, once the point goes into the opponent, you have to move the weapon. It's a bit long for me to do that in here because I'm not sitting on a horse. You have to move the arm through an arc like this, or like this, or like this, depending which direction and height your opponent that you've just run through is at, to, as you ride past, to let the weapon come out again. And you do the exact same thing with lances in, well, using lances against other people, but additionally in the sport which still exists today, or known as tent pegging, where you have to basically skewer a wooden peg and then let the lance go through so you don't get carried off your horse, obviously. So in some sense you could say, well, a curved blade, you could deliver point and then let it go through. Yeah, that's kind of true, and yes, you can deliver point with these, but you will notice that the point is situated at the back of the blade, okay? So that is not really ideal for delivering point with a curved sword or with any sword. You really want a spear point, which is what the British swords had at the time. I'm not just patriotic and saying British swords are better. In many ways they're not, actually, and that's probably a topic for a much bigger video, but I'm just saying really this sword is not well adapted to thrusting, despite the fact that the French military like to thrust. Why? I don't know. I haven't studied the French sources enough. I've got friends like Maxime Chouinard, for example, and other Fabrice Cognot and other people, Jules Gary, who writes books about French bayonet manuals and other things, sword manuals as well. So I've got friends who read French or are French and who are studying those things, and I don't know an answer why were the French taught to thrust on horseback and yet they had curved, most of them anyway, had curved swords. As you know from my previous videos, the cuirassiers, or the heavies, the breastplated guys with helmets, they had straight swords, as you'd expect for thrusting. So why did the light cavalry have curved swords? We don't exactly know, or at least I don't know. Maybe someone out there knows. If you know, feel free to share below. But really what I wanted to say to you guys is I was reminded when I got this sword, and you will notice this is a bit grubby, it's a bit rusty, and I'll mention in the main video I'm actually going to show cleaning this up, because this is a relatively easy restoration job. So I'm going to film it and show it, okay? But when I got this sword, it's been service sharpened and remains quite sharp, which is relatively unusual for French swords. Most French swords, for some reason, that hit the antique market have not been sharpened, but some have. This has been very well sharpened, and again, I'll talk more about that on the main video. But when I got this, it was a really nice sword. I was reminded of how nice these swords, they're big, 36-inch blade, but how nice these can be in the hand, very satisfying. And it brought me around to one thing. There is another sword I have actually, which is coming up for sale soon, that is based on this. So I can do a quick comparison for you guys, for your eyes only. And I will again do a more fulsome video about this on the public channel. But this is a little preview for you folks. I've got the American Model 1860, which was a revision of the Model 1840. Now, the Model 1840, sometimes colloquially known as the wrist breaker, was heavier than the 1860 model. They lightened it up for 1860. Ironically, why they ended up with the 1840 being so clunky and heavy, I don't know, because it was modelled on this, and actually the Model 1860 is about the same weight and size as the original French 1822. But what I really wanted to say is, despite the fact that one is clearly based on the other, there are some design differences, which I'd never taken precise notice of before, but putting them next to each other, the American swords have a ricasso at the base. The French swords do not, okay? So ricasso, you'll see this rectangular section here. Now, funnily enough, that's a kind of British and German feature. French swords don't have it so much. You'll notice the French sword here just goes straight into the fuller goes all the way to the guard pretty much and kind of phases out gradually. Whereas this actually has this very sort of rectangular section, ricasso, at the bottom. That's what you get on British swords. So for some reason the Americans decided to not copy the French way and have a kind of German-British style ricasso. The guards are very, very similar. I will say the American guard is slightly smaller than the French guard. The pommels are very similar, but again the pommel on the French sword is slightly bigger, which I think is actually slightly better. I think it looks better, and I think it's better for your hand not slipping down. The grips are slightly different. You'll notice the French grip is broad at the base and tapers down, but then kicks out at the pommel end. The American one actually swells in the middle. It has a kind of fattened section in the middle. You need that fattened section in the middle if you don't have the big pommel to stop your hand sliding down, okay? And the blades are quite similar, but to my eyes anyway, the French sword is very much better made. Now, this American example is made, it's marked US, so it's northern states, as it were, US 1865 AGM, okay, and it's made by C. Roby, one of the main makers, in W. Chelmsford, which I imagine is West Chelmsford, Massachusetts. So it's made by a good maker in 1865. Hasn't been service sharpened, probably didn't see service in the US Civil War, but is really at the end of, it's just after, probably, never saw service, but was probably churned out of the factory in this kind of same run as all the Civil War swords. I'm a civil servant, so I think civil service, Civil War swords. But the French sword is very definitely, to my eyes, better made. And one of the examples of that is both these swords have, I'll just show on the French sword alone, so I've got both hands free. We have a secondary fuller down here. So you've got a main fuller and then a thin fuller at the back. And that's called the Montmorency style fuller, I believe, and the lines and the grinding on the French sword is very much more precise and deep and crisp than the American sword. See Roby's work. This is Châtellerault, incidentally. There were kind of 3 or 4 main factories of French weapons, but Châtellerault was one of the biggest. Klingenthal was the other biggest. But the secondary fuller in the American sword is, I would describe it as quite lackluster. It's there, but it's not really doing anything. It's not really very deep, and the ends of it are not particularly well formed. It's just not such a well-made sword, the American sword. Now you could excuse the Americans because, of course, they were at the end of the Civil War. They'd been churning out huge numbers of armaments. Yep, absolutely, I accept that. But it has to be said, if you, generally speaking, compare American swords of the 19th century with European swords of the 19th century, they're not generally as well made. Yes, there are some very well made examples marketed by Tiffany's and other companies, but generally speaking, the average quality of American swords in the 19th century is not so good, I would say, as European. My own experience of revolvers, I have to say, is much similar. If we look at the 1850s, if you look at a 1850s Colt Navy, for example, despite the fact they're made to good tolerances and the parts are interchangeable and all those things we know about Colt revolvers that are famous, my opinion, looking at British revolvers, is the British revolvers which were handmade and they didn't have interchangeable parts and they cost a lot more, but they are much better made. Yet, you could argue they were slightly more fragile, more prone to faults because they were more complicated mechanisms, because Colt owned the patent to the simple revolving mechanism. So European makers were forced to get around that patent by making more complicated mechanisms. But if you just compare, for example, a Beaumont Adams of 1860 with a Colt revolver of 1860, say a Colt Navy, then usually the Beaumont Adams is very much better made. It's got much better craftsmanship on it. Why that was the case, I don't know. Maybe there was more skilled labour in Europe. Maybe people were just willing to pay more for their stuff in Europe at that point. I don't know. Anyway, there's a brief look at the French 1822 bancal. As I said, I will talk about this more on the main channel. But my view is, despite the fact that the US 1860 is based on it, the French sword that it originates from is a very much better thing. So I'm really sorry to say that to the Americans, but you have got at least the fact, knowing that a lot of the US Civil War swords were used in really, some of the most important kind of battles actually of the mid 19th century. Whereas, you could say for the French part, yes, Crimean War, the invasion of China, the French were doing very interesting things as well. But the US Civil War is a very fascinating bit of history. And often with antique weapons, it doesn't always come down to what's the individual quality of the weapon, but, what's it connected to, what's its place in history. And US Civil War weapons are very, very interesting for that reason. Cheers for tuning in, and I'll see you guys for the next Patreon video or on the main channel. But thanks for following, and see you soon. Cheers! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.